Hi, Donnie from Handboards, Subskate, and HST Trucks here. This presentation is the physics of flow. Let's get on with it. How longboard skaters generate thrust without foot pushing. The bottom line up front is that during S turns, the rider pushes in opposite directions with their front and rear foot, basically pushing that truck in the direction it's already turning in opposite directions, resulting in a rear thrust and a front thrust, which are added together, which propels the rider forward without foot pushing. But the rider has to be twisting. To define a few terms, longboards are specialized skateboards that the rider can turn by leaning without the need to lift the front wheels off the ground, like with regular skateboards. I know you can loosen up regular skateboards and turn them, but just bear with me. Longboards are considered counter-phase turning mechanisms. Here we consider three center of turning categories: centered, back foot, and rear axle. That means, where does the board actually turn? What is the pivot point of the board as you're riding it? This correlates to different riding styles: centered carving, back foot carving, also surf skating, and pumping. Okay. I'll show you some force vector diagrams. I'll show you about the technique, and I'll talk about how the HST truck system, which is designed for carving, not surf skating, all the components are interchangeable, and you can try all these different riding styles. Centered longboards, the midpoint of turning is at the middle of the wheelbase because the front and rear turn equal and opposite. Back foot longboards, the center of turning of the system is underneath the back foot because the front turns more than the rear. The rear axle longboards only turn in the front, so the center of turning is right on that rear axle. And these three different types of longboard setups correspond to centered carving, to coin a phrase, back foot carving, again, coining another phrase, also surf skating, and then pumping, where the front of the board does all the work. You can pause this if you like to read the details, but I've tried to organize these different styles in terms of mechanics, stability, technique, and feel. Long story short, center carving is what handboards have always been. I have seen people crush pumping on our centered carving boards without having a foot push. They're insane. Back foot carving is where the front's turning a lot more than the rear, and so the front of the board is taking a wider path. Pumping is standing right on the front truck and just making it go. And surf skating is just like back foot carving, except the turning and leaning axes are not perfectly coordinated. In some cases, there's two different axes for front and for turning and leaning. Whereas in back foot carving, the turn and lean are coordinated according to a very basic geometry. This is Corey Lopez riding a centered longboard, basically carving it up a hill. He's not cheating. There's no wind to his back. I mean, he's just pushing with his rear foot and pushing with his front foot, and he's going. Here's a video of Hunter Joslin, iconic surfer, founder of Endo Board. He's riding a back foot longboard. And you can notice how the front truck is moving a wider path than the rear. He's pushing really hard on both the back and front foot. A quick aside, surf skate coaches often recommend that their riders push harder with their rear foot, which is the right coaching, and it may lead to a counterintuitive result, which is, in order to push harder on your rear foot, you have to have an equal and opposite reaction somewhere. So that means you end up pushing much harder on your front foot to get more push on your rear foot. I'll talk more about that in a second. This is Landy Kook, who's pumping. He's a world-class LDP athlete. He is standing pretty much over the front truck. Both his feet are pushing the truck in the direction it's turning. Notice how the rear truck is pretty much following the line that he's traveling. So you might call it a dead rear end, and the front is doing all the work. Centered, back foot, and rear axle are board setups, okay? Why do I call this centered? Well, because the front's turning this way, the rear's turning that way, and where these two lines intersect, it's at the middle of the board. Back foot, this turns this much, that turns that much. Where they line up is near the rear foot. Rear axle, where they line up is under the rear axle. Again, centered, center carving, back foot carving, rear axle, pumping. This is an illustration of the HSE truck system showing the spring and the wave cam and the bushing and the whole deal. But what I want to draw your attention to is this angle. This is called the kingpin angle. It's 40 degrees from the plane of the deck. This angle of 40 degrees, it's what coordinates turning and leaning. It's locked into that ratio, okay? This is different than surf skates that have basically two pivot axes, where a turning is separate from lean. That's why I draw the distinction between back foot carving and surf skating, even though the technique is the same. Here we have side views of the trucks. I won't take too much time on here, but I have a 0 degree, 20, 40, and 55 in this truck. This is what they look like. So here, remember that kingpin angle I was talking about before? For the 40 degree, you get 27 degrees of board lean and 23 degrees of axle turn coordinated. If it was 45 degrees, those two numbers would be the same. For 20 degrees, I get half that much. For 55 degrees, I get more. So if you lock in a number in your head, the 0 turns 0, the 20 turns about 10, the 40 turns about 20, the 55 turns about 30. I used easy math for the rest of this chart. Turning radius is a function of wheelbase, but it's also a function of the combined angles of the front and rear. So for the blue data here, which is measured experimentally, this is a centered longboard with 40-40, and you can see that the longer the wheelbase, the longer the turning radius. And if you have a back foot, same thing. The longer the radius, the longer the wheelbase, the longer the radius. And if you have a back axle, you get an even longer turning radius. I'll get into this in the next chart, but essentially you add this angle to the negative of this angle to figure out radius, which is a function of the wheelbase divided by the tangent of the front angle minus the tangent of the rear angle. And in this case, since the rear is turning in the opposite direction of the front, you put a negative sign, so you're basically adding them together. This is the fun chart. Okay. Most ham boards have been centered carving boards with a 40 kingpin on the front and a 40 kingpin in the rear. Essentially, this turning radius of the board is 1.2 times the distance between the axles, which is about the length of the deck. So turning radius is about equal to the length of the board. The 55-20 setup we have is also about 1.2 times the wheelbase, but that's a back foot turning carving board. So we're calling those to intermediate skill level. And if you really want to get adventuresome, you can try a 55-20, which its turning radius is less than the distance between the axles. And some of these are crazy. And if a 40-0 or a 55-0, which is used for pumping, that could be much longer than the length of the wheelbase. But this is generally how this works. The centered about 40 degrees, 55-20, back foot about 40 degrees, 55-0, back axle about 30 degrees. This is a force vector diagram. I got help from a professor at Purdue University to get me over a mental block on it. Then I turned it 90 degrees. And the thing I want to draw your attention to here is that if the rider's pushing with both their feet to the left, let's say this length equals the number of pounds they're putting, right? So the longer that line, the more pounds. Well, that creates an equal and opposite reaction in this opposite, meaning in the same direction. But because the front is turned, the only way to create that component is for the actual resultant force to come out through this axle direction. Okay, so in order to get this arrow to be the same length as this opposite arrow, you end up having to have a forward thrust. That's where forward pumping comes from. So let's talk about axle paths. This is a rear foot board. I'm sorry, yes, a rear foot board going through S turns, turning counterclockwise, clockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise. And let's say we fill in that gap with all these decks, okay? Then we draw a gray line through the rear axle. We draw a solid line through the front axle. Now I get 3 curves, okay? And then I get rid of the center of turning line, and now I just have the front and rear axle, and then I line them up. You can see here that the front axle is traveling a wider path than the rear axle. Now, in order to create force, the rider needs to twist clockwise here, twist counterclockwise here, twist clockwise here. It's the twisting, because if you don't twist, you're cruising. If you go into a turn and you just push out with both feet, it's super fun. It's like spilling speed on a snowboard. And get your edge in. It's so fun. But don't expect to create forward thrust that way. All right. Now, if you push in opposite directions, you create a forward thrust with the front to add to the rear thrust from the rear. If you're cruising, you're going to create a drag force vector with the front. And you can pause this and look at the force vector diagrams. The only difference between left and right, other than the color, is the direction of this arrow. That's the direction that the rider is pushing. Okay? So to create forward thrust, the rider twists and front and rear thrust are added together. The rider's not twisting, they're cruising. The rear thrust that they get for free is canceled out by dragging the front. And here's where you do it in the turn. You come into a turn, you're at switch. Now you start twisting, pushing feet in equal and opposite directions, and then you switch to clockwise on the other dimension. If I blow this thing up and get real specific and put numbers in, and I can actually calculate how much forward thrust a rider can generate on in this case, a rear foot longboard with 30 degrees in the front, -10 in the back. If the rider pushes in this direction with 10 pounds force and an equal and opposite 10 pounds force there, because otherwise, how are they going to get leverage to make it? It's got to be equal and opposite. They can generate about 3.7 pounds of forward thrust. So this plus this equals 3.7 pounds. Turns out that about 3.3 of it is front pull and 0.4 pounds is rear thrust. So it's about a 90-10 ratio. In this little table down here, I've done some calculations. So if a rider can make 10 pounds force left and 10 pounds force right, depending on the geometry of their setup, they can create between 2 and 5 pounds of force, forward thrust, every single S-turn. Coming back, the centered back foot and rear axle vector diagrams, force diagrams look different because in the rear axle, they can use both feet to make a much bigger force vector in that direction, resulting in a much bigger resultant force. And so they can get quite a bit of power out of a rear axle system. Similarly, for a centered board, if you do it right, you can get a really big forward thrust and a really big rear thrust that pretty much comes along for free. And I've seen people riding longboards and our handboards that are centered, crushing, making speed without foot pushing because they know how to twist at the right moment on each turn. Back foot boards are actually, frankly, easier to learn how to pump because all you really have to do is think about the front foot, right? So to recap, riders can generate forward thrust on any type of longboard. That's what we call carving, okay? Center of turning location is critical. Centered longboards can get equal front pull and push from the rear. Back foot longboards get mostly pull from the front, less push from the rear. Rear axle longboards are pretty much 100% pull. And the HST truck systems, which are for carving, they're not surf skate trucks because there's not the turn and the lean are coordinated geometrically. Surf skates have separate axes for turning and carving. I'm sorry, turning and leaning, and they're really fun. It's just different. But the HST truck system are interchangeable and modular for any of these setups. It all works. Okay, I hope you liked it. If you have any comments, please leave them for me. I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.